When my billionaire grandfather died, my greedy relatives inherited the mansions, the offshore trust funds, and the corporate empire. I got a rusty iron key and a condescending smirk from my uncle. They thought they had ruined my life, but that useless piece of metal unlocked a billion-dollar secret they completely missed. The rain came down in sheets on the day we buried Arthur Hastings. Standing by the open grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery, I watched the water pool on the polished mahogany of his casket. I had spent the last 10 years of my life caring for him, managing his medications, reading him his favorite biographies when his eyesight failed, and listening to his endless, fascinating stories about his early days as an industrial surveyor. I loved him fiercely. Across the grave stood the rest of the Hastings family. My Uncle Raymond, a man whose tailored Italian suits couldn't hide the predatory hunch of his shoulders, was checking his Rolex under the cover of a massive black umbrella. Beside him was his sister, my Aunt Celeste, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, already calculating the square footage of the family estate. Then there was my cousin Leo, who spent the entire service texting on his phone. None of them had visited Arthur in over 4 years. They only showed up when the doctors called to say the end was near circling, like vultures smelling blood in the water. 2 days later, we gathered in the freezing, overly air-conditioned conference room of Finch and Associates in downtown Boston. Gregory Finch, my grandfather's estate lawyer, sat at the head of a massive oak table, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Arthur Hastings was a man of immense foresight. "Mr." Finch began his voice, a dry, papery whisper that forced all of us to lean in. He amended his will exactly 3 weeks before his passing. I will read the distribution of assets as requested. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. I didn't want the yachts or the private jets. I only hoped grandfather had left me enough to pay off the crushing student loans I had deferred to become his full-time caretaker, and perhaps the small cottage on the edge of his Massachusetts estate where we used to drink tea and play chess. To my eldest son, Raymond Hastings. Finch read, "I leave the entirety of my shares in Hastings Industrial alongside the commercial real estate portfolio." Raymond leaned back, a smug, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. "To my daughter Celeste Hastings, I leave the primary family estate in Concord, the summer home in Nantucket, and the liquid assets held in the Swiss accounts." Celeste let out a breath she had been holding immediately, shooting a triumphant glare at her brother. To my grandson, Leo Hastings, I leave the 2 trust funds established in 2010 to be disbursed immediately without condition. Leo didn't even look up from his phone, just offered a lazy thumbs up. My heart began to pound against my ribs. Finch turned the page. The silence in the room stretched until it felt suffocating. Finch cleared his throat, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Pity, confusion. And finally to my granddaughter Clara Hughes, for her years of unwavering loyalty and care. Finch paused, reaching beneath his desk. He brought up a small, heavily battered wooden cigar box and slid it across the polished table towards me. "I leave my leather journal and the key that opens the past." I stared at the box. My hands trembled as I unlatched the brass clasp and opened the lid. Inside rested a thick, frayed leather journal, its pages yellowed and curling. On top of it sat a heavy, rusted iron key. It looked like it belonged to an old farmhouse door, heavily oxidized and completely unremarkable. There were no checks, no deeds, no trust funds, just a book and a piece of scrap metal. A sharp, barking laugh echoed through the room. It was Raymond. "A journal and a rusty key." Raymond sneered, leaning over the table to inspect my inheritance. "Well, Clara, I suppose that's what you get for being the favorite. Maybe the key opens a shed full of his old gardening tools. Raymond, don't be cruel, Celeste said, though her voice dripped with fake sympathy. She turned to me. Clara, dear, you must understand. Father was losing his mind near the end. We all know it. It's a tragedy he didn't secure your financial future, but I'm afraid I'll need you to vacate the Concord estate by Friday. I have contractors coming in to gut the West Wing. I felt the blood drain from my face. Friday, Aunt Celeste, I've lived there for 10 years. All my belongings. Friday, Clara. She repeated, her tone hardening into steel. You're 30 years old. It's time you stopped mooching off the family name and got a real job. I looked desperately at Mr. Finch, hoping there was a second page, a hidden codicil, a mistake, but the lawyer just averted his eyes and closed the thick leather binder. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I didn't care about the billions, but to be left with absolutely nothing, to be thrown out on the street by the family that abandoned him. Had my grandfather really gone senile? Had the last 10 years been for nothing? I picked up the heavy, rusted key. It felt cold against my palm. As I walked out of that office, the sound of Leo and Raymond joking about which sports cars they were going to buy followed me down the hallway. I felt utterly broken, holding what I believed was the ultimate proof of a dying man's dementia. By the end of the week, my entire life had been boxed up and moved into a cramped, damp studio apartment in South Boston. The radiator hissed violently at night, and the single window looked out over a brick alleyway. I had exactly $1,200 in my savings account. For the first few days, I couldn't even bring myself to look at the wooden box. I felt a toxic mixture of grief for the grandfather I missed and bitter anger for what he had done to me. I had given up my 20s. I had watched my friends build careers, get married, and travel the world, while I mashed up pills in applesauce and took blood pressure readings. One rainy Tuesday night, unable to sleep, I finally pulled the leather journal from the box. I needed answers. I needed to know if the man I loved was truly gone before he died, or if this was some twisted final joke. I opened the journal. The pages were densely packed with Arthur's sharp, cramped handwriting. But it wasn't a diary. It was a chaotic mess of geological survey notes, atmospheric data, and soil pH levels dating back to 1978. Page after page of boring, incomprehensible data about dirt. Frustrated, I flipped to the very back of the book. There on the last page, the handwriting changed. It was larger, shakier his writing from just a few months ago. It read, "The vultures only look up, Clara. They never look down. Remember the games we played on Sunday mornings? The knight moves in an L. The rook moves straight. Apply the grid." My breath hitched. Sunday mornings. Every Sunday, Arthur and I used to play a highly complex game. He invented mixing chess mechanics with word ciphers. He wasn't senile. He was lucid until the very end. I rushed to my tiny kitchen table and grabbed a pen and a notepad. I went back to the first page of the journal. The dates. Instead of standard dates, they were written strangely 2/4, 3/11/5/4/2. It wasn't February 4th. It was a grid coordinate. Row 2, word 4. Heart pounding, I spent the next 4 hours furiously decoding the seemingly random geological notes using the grid system he had taught me. As the sun began to rise over the Boston skyline, casting a grey light into my apartment, the decoded message finally stared back at me from my notepad. Larimer. State line. They thought I was chasing ghosts. The pyrope garnets do not lie. The pipe is intact. Deed in Shormut. Box 814. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Larimer State Line, Pyrope Garnets. I opened my laptop and typed the terms into a search engine. The results hit me like a shockwave. The State Line Kimberlite District is a remote, rugged area bordering Colorado and Wyoming. In the late 1970s, geologists discovered kimberlite pipes there, the rare volcanic rock formations that bring rough diamonds to the surface from deep within the Earth's mantle. Several companies had mined there, but operations had largely been abandoned or deemed commercially unviable decades ago. Pyrope garnets are known in geology as indicator minerals. Where you find them, you find diamonds. But what was Shawmut? I picked up the heavy, rusted key. I walked over to the window, letting the morning light hit the oxidized metal. I rubbed my thumb hard against the bow of the key, scraping away years of grime and rust. There barely legible was a tiny faded stamp S and G, Shawmut Depository. Shawmut Bank was a historic Boston institution that had been bought out and absorbed in the late 90s, but the private safe deposit branch in the financial district was still independently maintained under a new name. At 9 a.m. sharp, I was standing in the marble-floored lobby of the private vault facility on State Street. The teller, a stern-looking older woman, examined the key. "We haven't seen a Series 4 key in a very long time," she murmured, eyeing my exhausted face and wrinkled clothes with mild suspicion. "Name and box number. Arthur Hastings, box 814. I have the death certificate and the estate executor paperwork." I said, my voice trembling slightly as I slid the documents across the counter. After what felt like an agonizing hour of legal verifications, a silent security guard escorted me down into the subterranean vault. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and old paper. We walked down endless rows of steel doors until he stopped at a large, heavy box near the bottom corner. "Number 814. He inserted his master key, and I inserted my rusty iron key. Click. The guard pulled the long metal drawer out, placed it on a private viewing table in a small side room, and left me alone, closing the door behind him. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely lift the lid of the box. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. There was a thick manila envelope and a small, heavy canvas pouch. I opened the envelope first. It was an original yellowed property deed dating back to 1979, granting Arthur Hastings sole ownership of a 500-acre plot of completely undeveloped mountainous land in Larimer County, Colorado. Attached to the deed was a private sealed assay report from an independent geological firm dated just 6 months before Arthur died. I read the summary at the bottom of the report. Core samples confirm massive undisturbed kimberlite pipe extending vertically for at least 800 meters. Density of gem-quality macro diamonds exceeds initial 1978 projections by a factor of 50. Estimated subterranean value, unquantifiable without heavy excavation. I dropped the paper. I slowly reached for the heavy canvas pouch and untied the leather drawstring. I poured the contents onto the stainless steel table. Out tumbled a dozen dull, cloudy, glass-like stones. They didn't sparkle like the diamonds in a jewelry store. They were rough, uncut, and raw. But they were massive. The largest one was the size of a quail's egg. I collapsed into the chair, laughing and sobbing all at once. Raymond and Celeste thought they had won. They took the company the houses and the bank accounts. They thought they had left me with dirt. But Arthur Hastings was a man who understood the earth. He hadn't left me a rusted key. He had handed me the keys to an unmined kingdom. But possessing a deed to a diamond mine and actually extracting out the wealth from it were two very different things. And when my Uncle Raymond found out what I was sitting on, I knew the real war was about to begin. The discovery of the Larimer County property was a secret I had to guard with my life. I knew my Uncle Raymond. If he suspected for 1 second that the old man's madness was actually a calculated multi-billion-dollar legacy, he would move to contest the will-fabricate evidence of undue influence, or simply have his high-priced lawyers bury me in litigation until I was forced to sell the rights for pennies. I spent the next 2 weeks living like a fugitive. I abandoned the studio apartment and moved into a low-profile extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of the city. I registered a shell corporation, Hughes Geological Holdings, using a remote lawyer I found through a secure encrypted portal. My goal was simple: get the land surveyed and verified by a third party, and then secure the mineral rights before Raymond's team of corporate spies caught on. But the Hastings family were not the type of people to let a loose end just dangle. One Tuesday, I returned to my hotel room to find the door slightly ajar. My pulse hammered in my throat. I didn't enter. Instead, I retreated to the lobby and called the front desk, claiming I'd forgotten my laptop in the room and asking them to send security up. As I watched from the safety of the elevator lobby, I saw a man in a nondescript grey suit step out of my room and walk briskly toward the emergency exit. It was Leo. My cousin, the one who couldn't be bothered to look up from his phone at the funeral, was now stalking at me. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I retreated to a public library, my heart racing, and accessed my encrypted accounts. I had to accelerate the timeline. I booked a flight to Denver the following morning. I needed to see the land. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I could formulate a strategy to protect it. The journey to Larimer County felt like stepping into another world. Gone were the high rises and the stifling, polished boardrooms of Boston. In their place were the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies and the vast, unforgiving silence of the high plains. I rented a rugged 4x4 and drove for 6 hours deep into the wilderness using the coordinates provided in the assay report. When I finally reached the coordinates, the sight was breathtaking. It wasn't a pristine paradise. It was a scar in the earth. A deep natural depression sat in the center of a valley surrounded by ancient, craggy rock formations. As I walked the perimeter, the silence was absolute. I looked down at the ground. It was rich with dark, coarse soil, and scattered among the common river rocks were subtle, glittering flashes of dark purple and deep blood red. Pyrope garnets. They were everywhere, like spilled rubies in the dirt. I fell to my knees, digging into the earth with my bare hands. I wasn't just holding dirt. I was holding the evidence of a fortune that had been hidden in plain sight for 40 years. My grandfather hadn't lost his mind. He had been protecting this, waiting for the one person he knew wouldn't exploit it for ego or corporate greed. But the peace of the valley was shattered by the sound of a drone overhead. I froze, shielding my eyes from the sun. The sleek black device hovered, its camera lens fixed directly on me. My blood turned to ice. Raymond had tracked me. Within an hour of returning to my rental car, my phone began to buzz with a relentless, persistent vibration. It was Raymond. I ignored it, but he wouldn't stop. Finally, I answered. Clara. His voice was smooth, oily, and terrifyingly calm. I hope you're enjoying the fresh mountain air. It's a bit of a drive for a vacation, don't you think? How did you find me? I demanded, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline. Leo is, shall we say, remarkably proficient with tracking software. Raymond chuckled. And it's so disappointing that you've been keeping such massive secrets from your family. That land, Clara, it isn't yours. It was part of the Hastings Industrial Holdings. It was donated to a private trust in 1979 for tax purposes. I've already had my legal team pull the records. We'll be filing an injunction by morning to reclaim the property. Don't bother going back to Boston." "You're lying," I said, though my stomach turned. "The deed is in my name, and it was held in a secure depository for 40 years. Possession of a piece of paper doesn't equate to legal title, dear niece," he hissed. "You are an amateur playing a professional's game. Stay out there. Enjoy the view. Because when we're done, you won't even be able to afford the gas to drive back home." He hung up. I sat in the middle of that remote wilderness, the crushing weight of the situation settling over me. I was alone, millions of miles from help, and one of the most ruthless men in the country was coming for everything. But as I looked down at the deed in my passenger seat, I noticed something I had missed before. There was a faint, embossed stamp on the back of the deed, the Phoenix Clause. I didn't know what it meant, but I remembered Arthur's journals. He never did anything without a contingency. He hadn't just left me a key. He had left me a battlefield. And I realized then that if I wanted to win, I had to stop playing the victim and start playing the game on his terms. The return trip to Boston felt like walking willingly into the jaws of a trap, but fleeing wasn't an option anymore. I arrived back at my low-profile extended-stay hotel to find the door practically hanging off its hinges. Stepping inside, my blood ran cold. The room had been violently tossed. The mattress was slashed, my clothes were strewn across the cheap carpet, and my laptop was gone. But what hurt the most was the sight of the wooden cigar box, my grandfather's final gift, shattered into jagged splinters on the floor. They thought they had taken everything. They believed they had stripped me of my only leverage by stealing the digital files and the physical journal. What Raymond and Leo didn't understand was that I had spent a decade caring for Arthur Hastings. I knew how the man's mind worked. He never ever left a single point of failure. I pulled out a burner phone I had purchased in Denver and dialed the encrypted number for Harrison Croft, the remote attorney I had retained. "Mr. Croft." I said, my voice eerily calm, despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "They took the bait. The primary drive is compromised." "Understood, Clara." Harrison replied, the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "The dead man's switch is officially armed. If we don't input the secondary cipher within 48 hours, the complete geological survey, the deed authentications, and the chain of title will automatically forward to the SEC, the State Attorney General, and the managing partners at Bain Capital, the primary underwriters for your uncle's upcoming corporate merger." I hung up. Raymond wanted a war of attrition. He was about to get a nuclear detonation. The next morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of the Hastings Industrial Headquarters in the financial district. I didn't bother checking in with the polished receptionist. I walked straight toward the executive suites, flanked by the heavy, authoritative presence of Harrison Croft, who had flown in from Chicago that morning. I pushed open the frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom. Inside, Aunt Celeste was in the middle of a high-stakes presentation. Seated around the massive mahogany table were 3 stone-faced representatives from Bain Capital, reviewing the prospectus for a multi-billion-dollar luxury commercial development. "What is the meaning of this?" Celeste shrieked, dropping her laser pointer. Her face turned a blotchy, panicked red. "Security. Get this woman out of my building." "Sit down, Celeste," I said. My voice wasn't a yell. It was a commanding, razor-sharp command that echoed off the glass walls. I dropped a thick, leather-bound folio onto the center of the table. Raymond shoved past the glass doors a second later, 2 security guards trailing behind him. He looked at me, a cruel, victorious smirk playing on his lips. "Clara, I see you found your way back from Colorado. I'm surprised you have the nerve to show your face here after attempting to defraud this family. Guards escort her out. Touch me, I said, turning my gaze to the guards, and you'll be named as co-conspirators in a federal corporate espionage lawsuit. The guards froze. I looked back at Raymond. The smirk on his face began to waver. I'm here to discuss the Larimer project, Raymond, I stated smoothly. And by discuss I mean, I'm here to explain the terms of your surrender. You have nothing, Raymond hissed, stepping closer. We have the laptop. We have the journal. We filed the injunction this morning. That land is Hastings' industrial property. You have a decoy laptop and a book of riddles, Harrison Croft interjected, stepping forward to open the folio. He handed heavily redacted copies of our filings to the baffled Bain Capital executives. What my client has is the legal high ground backed by a contingency plan drafted by Arthur Hastings himself in 1979. I turned to my uncle, making sure every person in the room could hear me. Arthur knew you would try to steal the Kimberlite pipe. He knew your greed was your only true compass. So he embedded a poison pill deep in the foundational documents of this very company. He called it the Phoenix Clause. Raymond's face drained of all color. Celeste sank slowly into her leather ergonomic chair. The initial seed capital used to found Hastings Industrial was legally structured as a loan secured against the unmined assets of the Larimer County property. I explained, leaning over the table. The Phoenix Clause stipulates that if any blood relative attempts to legally contest the transfer of the Larimer deed to its designated heir, the original 1978 loan defaults. The underlying ownership of Hastings Industrial, your entire empire, your real estate, your pending mergers reverts to a public trust to satisfy the debt. The boardroom was dead silent. The silence was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. The Bain Capital representatives slowly closed their folders, looking at Raymond with eyes like ice. "You're bluffing," Raymond whispered. His hands were visibly shaking against the edge of the mahogany table. "Check the SEC filings, Raymond. The data packets are locked and loaded. If you try to seize my land, you lose the company. If you back off and drop the injunction, the company stays yours, and I quietly develop my property on my own time. But if you or Leo ever send a drone, a spy, or a lawyer my way again—" I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over him like a shroud. "I will burn the entire Hastings empire to the ground, and I will dance in the ashes." It was the ultimate gamble. I didn't have the billions required to fight him in court for a decade, but I possessed the one weapon they couldn't counter: the willingness to destroy everything. They were terrified of losing their status. I had already lost everything and survived. Raymond stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. In my eyes he didn't see the quiet, submissive girl who had mashed up pills and read biographies. He saw his father. He saw the ruthless, calculating brilliance of Arthur Hastings staring back at him. "Drop the injunction," Raymond rasped, not breaking eye contact. He looked completely hollowed out. "Smart choice," I said quietly. I picked up my empty folio and turned toward the door. I walked out of that skyscraper, a completely different woman than the one who had been laughed out of the lawyer's office weeks prior. I hadn't just secured a diamond mine. I had forged myself in the fire of my family's betrayal. The road ahead was going to be brutal, navigating the mining industry, hiring contractors, and turning raw earth into polished stones. But the rough pyrope garnets, sitting in the vault, weren't just rocks anymore. They were proof that true power isn't handed to you in a will. It's dug out of the dirt with your own two hands. What would you do if your family left you with nothing but a rusty key, only to discover it unlocked a billion-dollar empire? Would you take the money and run, or would you stick around, to exact your revenge. If you want to hear how Clara fights back against her ruthless uncle and builds her own diamond empire, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Part 4 concludes this saga, but the journey is just beginning.